The crunch of gravel beneath the wheels echoed like a silent farewell as my son left. There was no wave, no promise to keep in touch, just the sound of the Cadillac engine hastily backing down the winding dirt road that led to the country house in suburban Ohio, a place I hadn't been to in more than a decade. I stood on the porch, gently pulling the scarf around my simple black dress, the dress I'd worn to my husband Henry's funeral 3 months ago. The red taillights of the wheelchair disappeared behind the red maple trees, leaving me alone in the oppressive silence. The silence offered no comfort, but felt like a heavy blanket, pressing down on my heart, a feeling only those who have been isolated can understand. "You'll feel better here," my son Christian had said before he left, his voice carrying the pride my brother had honed over his years as a successful Chicago real estate investor. "The city isn't for you anymore. Too loud, too full of painful memories." He spoke as if 40 years of living with Henry were an antique, as easily discarded as a worn-out armchair. I turned to look at the house, our once home, mine and Henry's, now a cold ruin. The east porch was rotten, the shutters trembling as if they were about to snap. The white paint was peeling, fading to a dull gray, like wind-worn stone. Henry had dreamed of renovating this place into a peaceful retreat for his old age, but now it was just a cage with no way out for me. The key screeched in the lock, as if the house itself had protested my presence. The screech echoed from the withered wheat fields that surrounded it, where no one else had passed. Inside, the air was heavy and dusty, suspended in the orange glow of the sunset that filtered through the stained glass windows. A strange scent wafted in, a mix of forgotten and slightly sweet with a hint of decay that made my stomach lurch. I dragged my suitcase inside, the wheels clicking on the old oak floors, leading me to the master bedroom, which had been Henry and I's private sanctuary. The bedroom was as familiar as the last time Henry and I had walked in together. Henry's mother's quilt was neatly placed at the foot of the bed. My reading glasses lay quietly on the nightstand, and his old gardening shoes stood alone by the door. I sat on the edge of the bed, feeling the old springs creak under my weight. A silence filled the air, like a cold stream of water, pressing down on my chest, pressing against my ears. There were no cars, no distant sirens, and no arguments from nearby houses like when I lived in the city. There was only the creaking of rotting wood and the distant howls of wild animals in the slowly falling night. My son, Christian, had been frighteningly careful to send me to this exile. There was no Wi-Fi. "You don't need that," he said. "No landline." Who uses landlines anymore? My cell phone showed only a weak signal, flickering like a dying breath. He had even confiscated my old Ford key, saying it was expensive and not worth keeping. "I'll take care of things in the city," Christian assured me confidently. "Sandra and I will visit you every few weeks. You just need to rest." Rest. The word left a bitter taste in my mouth. At 62, he seemed to want me to fade away quietly, like an old photograph burned away by the sun. I opened my suitcase and began to unpack mechanically. A few dark-colored dresses, as if I were still living in the dark days after the funeral. A few underwear, enough shoes for a week. Prescription bottles piled in the corner of the suitcase. Sedatives, anti-anxiety pills, and something for the arthritis pain that had begun to creep into my fingers. As I hung my clothes in the closet, my hand brushed against Henry's old wool coat. It still had the light pine scent he wore, mixed with the faint scent of cigar smoke from Saturday nights. I pressed my face against the fabric and inhaled deeply, taking solace in the memory. Suddenly, my hand hit something hard behind a layer of old clothes in the closet. I pushed the clothes aside and found a stack of small wooden boxes, neatly stacked but covered in dust. Each box bore a label written in Henry's careful handwriting: personal notes, soil studies, and dates from the last 3 years of his life. My heart pounded as I picked up the first box. It was heavier than I expected, filled with yellowed paper documents and thick notebooks. But what made my hands tremble was a small leather-bound notebook sandwiched between two larger files. On the cover, the words H. Lawson Agricultural Project Personal were embossed in black ink. When I opened the leather-bound notebook, I immediately recognized Henry's straightforward, neat, and systematic handwriting, as if he were still sitting there, taking notes with the meticulousness and precision of an engineer. Date 732. The specimen showed exceptional growth. The roots were deeper than expected, and the planting area needed to be expanded next summer. I flipped through pages filled with intricate sketches, soil pH charts, and notes as complex as chemical formulas. Henry was a bridge engineer, not a botanist. So, what were these numbers and formulas? Date 801. Professor Thompson had confirmed the preliminary results. The extracted compound was 92% pure, with huge potential for medical applications. The regional market demand was estimated at more than 1.8 million units per year. My heart pounded, my chest tightened. Medical applications? Market demand? Henry had never said a word to me about this. As night fell over the wheat fields outside, I continued reading by the dim yellow light of an old desk lamp. The pages became increasingly detailed, not just about the characteristics of the strange plant Henry was secretly studying, but also about the business plan, patent applications, a list of potential distributors, an estimate of initial costs. Day 987. Initial funding secured, equipment shipped to the southern warehouse. If I were no longer here, Clara would find all the instructions. She was stronger than Christian knew and more resilient than she realized. I stopped suddenly, put the notebook down, my hands shaking. Henry had known all this. Somehow he had guessed that Christian would push me aside, see me as a burden instead of the wife he had built his life with for 40 years. The thought of Henry silently preparing for my future, even as his health was failing, brought tears to my eyes, breaking down the strong wall I had built over the months to contain my pain. But where was the envelope Henry had mentioned? Driven by a strange, urgent feeling, I rummaged through the wooden boxes, papers, and old photos scattered across the bedroom floor. Finally, I found it, a sealed craft envelope in Henry's familiar handwriting. For Clara, when they forget your strength, H.L. Inside were a detailed handwritten note, two business cards, and I caught my breath when I saw a wad of cash, all $50 bills. I counted it over and over again, exactly 3,000. Henry's letter was written in a calm, clear voice, like a carefully calculated blueprint. Clara, if you're reading this, I'm gone and they've overlooked you. You've always been the one to turn my ideas into reality, with your practicality and ingenuity. The plant in the notebook grew wild on 30 acres south of our property. Professor Margaret Thompson, botanist, business card included, helped him confirm their medicinal value. Robert Klein, agricultural consultant, business card included, knows how to farm efficiently. The Western barn has been fully equipped for the past 2 years. You have everything you need to build a sustainable future. They want you to retire quietly, Clara. Let them see you can cultivate a fertile field. I sat among the papers, clutching the letter to my chest. The silence in the house was no longer oppressive, but seemed to hold a promise, like the tension before a storm. Outside, the wind rustled through the maple trees, whispering encouragement. Somewhere in the darkness, Henry's herbs waited for someone determined enough to awaken them. Christian thought that pushing me here would cause me to wither in solitude, but he had no idea what he had awakened. I folded the letter carefully and put it back in the envelope. Tomorrow, I would survey the southern 30 acres. I would call Professor Thompson from the only coffee shop in town with a cell phone. I would begin to transform this prison-like place into something Henry and I had never dreamed of. But tonight, I would make a plan. Tonight, I would remember who I was before the pain of loss overwhelmed me. The woman who had managed Henry's construction company for 15 years, raised the children, negotiated contracts, and kept the family running like a machine. The woman Christian had thought was a burden, now ready to wake up. Lying in bed, I held Henry's notebook close. In the darkness, I could hear him whispering in my ear, "You're stronger than they think, Clara. Tomorrow, you'll prove me right." As the first light of dawn gently filtered through the window, I stood by the kitchen window, wearing a warm sweater and jeans, holding Henry's notebook like a treasure to protect. I had barely slept last night, my mind racing with thoughts that filled my heart with both fear and hope. The old coffee maker in the corner of the kitchen hummed softly, one of the few modern appliances left in the small house in the remote countryside of Ohio. I held the phone up to the window, watching the bars on the screen flicker, sometimes unstable. At exactly 7:15 a.m., the signal stopped at a weak but steady bar, and I quickly dialed the first number on the business card Henry had left. "Professor Thompson," said a clear professional voice, with a slight Midwestern accent I couldn't quite place. I cleared my throat, suddenly feeling awkward, unsure of how to begin. "I'm Clara Lawson. I think you knew my husband, Henry." There was a brief pause, then her voice softened. "Mrs. Lawson, I'm so sorry for your loss. Henry was a very special person. I've always wondered what happened to his project." "I found his notebook last night," I said, my voice shaking slightly. "I need to know what he's been up to. Can you meet me today? I'm about a half-hour drive from you. There's a lot I want you to see." About 2 hours later, a dusty Toyota Prius rolled down the winding dirt road that led to my house. Professor Margaret Thompson got out, younger than I expected, about 50, her light brown hair tied back, her hands covered in dry dirt that showed she worked in the fields. She carried an old canvas backpack and worn hiking boots, looking like someone familiar with the wild fields. "Henry never told you about this project?" she asked, a hint of surprise in her eyes as we headed toward the southern fields. I sighed, unable to hide the bitter truth. My husband keeps a lot of secrets. Henry is a dreamer, and I am a practical man. Clearly, this was one of the dreams he had never shared. The path led through thick weeds, almost forgotten after months of neglect. But Margaret walked determinedly, leading me to a wilderness I rarely visited. Here, she pointed to the seemingly weedy bushes scattered across several acres. "My husband discovered something special." I knelt beside her as she gently pulled up one, revealing its intricate roots, almost like an elaborate blueprint. "Valeriana novellum," she said, her voice filled with reverence. "This species has never been documented before. Henry and I classified it 10 months ago. It is related to valerian, but its medicinal properties are completely unique." She opened her backpack and pulled out a glass vial of clear liquid. "This extract speeds up wound healing by 35%. It's more effective at relieving pain than many prescription drugs, and we're now studying its anti-inflammatory properties." She shook her head in amazement. "Pharmaceutical companies are willing to pay millions of dollars for a steady supply." I stared at the common plant in her hand. "And it just grows wild here." Her land was in perfect condition, Margaret explains. The soil, the drainage, everything was ideal. Henry spent 18 months mapping it out, testing extraction methods and predicting yields. We walked the fields for another hour, and she detailed Henry's work. He had identified 10 acres of land suitable for growing the plant. It was easy to grow, requiring minimal care once established. With the right equipment, each acre could produce $150,000 worth of extract per year. Why didn't he tell me? The question had haunted me since I found the notebook. Margaret paused, her eyes full of sympathy. Henry said that Christian didn't acknowledge his talents, especially after his illness. The family began to see him as weak. She paused, then added, Henry wanted to keep this project away from anyone who might take it. The words hit like a punch. After Henry's heart attack, Christian had taken control of the finances, claiming that Henry and I were both too emotional to make sound decisions. He transferred all of my savings to an account that required his signature to withdraw, saying that the pain of my loss had left me unprepared to manage my finances. Henry knew Christian would want to control her, Margaret said, but he never forgot the woman he built his construction company from scratch with. He wanted her to have another chance to shine. We walked home in silence, each lost in our own thoughts. As we approached the western shed, which I had assumed was just a storage area, Margaret stopped suddenly and pulled out a set of keys. Henry asked me to keep these, she said, and opened the heavy wooden door. Inside, a modern plant processing facility emerged. A gleaming stainless steel extraction machine, industrial drying racks, packaging equipment, and a small but sophisticated lab corner worth tens of thousands of dollars. All were covered with tarps, as if waiting to wake up. Henry has been putting it all together for the last 18 months, Margaret said. He wanted her to have a way to stand on her own, if she chose to. I touched the cold surface of the machine, imagining Henry working silently there, alone, when I thought he was just fixing some old things. The scale of the project was overwhelming. How much does it cost to get started? I asked. Margaret replied, You can start with what you have here. Hire 2 or 3 local workers to plant and harvest. Initial operating expenses are about $6,000 a month. She hesitated, then added, Henry said you had a knack for business. I almost laughed. A knack for business? For the past 15 years, I had managed everything for Henry's construction company, books and contracts, customer relations and regulations, so he could focus on designing bridges and roads. But after he died, Christian saw me as the guy who helped Dad with the paperwork. I understand business, I said simply. Margaret handed me a hardcover folder. Here's a list of contacts Henry has selected: equipment suppliers, potential distribution partners, and legal counsel. He's also surveyed the local labor force. There's a community college 15 miles away with a great agriculture program that's a major source of employment. That evening, Margaret stayed for dinner with me. We heated up a pot of canned pea soup on an old gas stove and talked about Henry's vision. She was not just a research partner, but also a close friend who understood the ambition behind his calm exterior. I thought he was just gardening for fun, I said. Margaret shook her head. Henry said retirement was suffocating him. He needed a purpose, something to build on, not just survive. She put down her spoon and looked at me. He also said that since he got sick, he let Christian make a lot of the decisions because it was easier to grieve than to fight. Her words touched a deep chord within me. When Henry was diagnosed with heart disease, I stepped back, letting Christian take control, believing his words that I was too weak to manage on my own. It was the easiest choice in the darkest period of my life. What do you need me to do to move forward? I asked. Collaboration, Margaret replied immediately. I'll handle the science and approvals, but the project needs someone who understands business, someone who can scale. Henry always said she was the financial brains of the family. After Margaret left, promising to return later in the week with planting plans and instructions on how to operate the machines, I sat quietly in the barn, surrounded by Henry's secret legacy. The stainless steel equipment gleamed under the neon lights, ready to transform the wild plants in the fields into something valuable. I remembered Christian's call a few days earlier, his tone patronizing. Is Mom okay? Did you get enough rest? He thought I was just hanging out by the window, reading romance novels or watching soap operas, waiting for him to arrange a nursing home. In fact, I was standing in a state-of-the-art herbal medicine factory, secretly built by my husband. The irony was hard to describe, but also precious. I picked up the phone and scrolled through the list of contacts Margaret had left: Robert Klein, an agricultural expert; Laura Bennett, a corporate lawyer. Two more unfamiliar names, but they had clearly recognized the potential of the wild plants growing there. For the first time in months, I felt a new sensation, not the pain of loss or resignation, but anticipation, as sharp and thrilling as the moment before a storm. Christian had left me here, thinking I would wither away in silence. His wife, Sandra, kept a fake smile on her face, promising to visit when she had time. Little did they know they had given me such a great opportunity. I locked the barn door and walked slowly toward the house under a sky of stars, their light more pure and real than any I had ever seen from my Chicago apartment. The heavy silence of the previous night seemed to ring with a new tone, full of promise and possibility. In the kitchenette, I opened Henry's notebook to a blank page and began to jot down my first thoughts. A business outline, a profit estimate, a hiring schedule, specific steps to turn Henry's discovery of the wild plant into the foundation of a financially independent future. The pen glided across the paper, and for the first time since Henry's funeral, a small smile touched my lips. Tomorrow, I'll call Robert Klein to discuss land reclamation and preparation for the expanded planting season. I'll contact Laura Bennett to move forward with the incorporation and patent process. I'll begin my journey to becoming the Clara my family never imagined, a woman who doesn't need approval or guidance, who can build a fortune from what was once considered worthless, growing wild in the fields while they thought I was dying in the backwoods of Ohio. The woman Henry trusted with all his heart is now ready to prove him right. 3 weeks after discovering Henry's notebook, at 6 a.m., I stood silently in the barn, watching Robert Klein bend over a soil sample through a handheld microscope. He was a lean man in his 50s, with calloused hands and the calm demeanor of someone who had spent his life working with every inch of land in rural Ohio. Henry was right about the microclimate here, he said in a low voice, adjusting the focus with a look of intense concentration. The soil pH is ideal for valerian. With careful preparation, we can double our planting area. I took careful notes in a hardcover notebook I'd bought from the town grocery store the week before, a trip of nearly 45 minutes each way in the old pickup I'd found gathering dust in the corner of the barn, the keys still dangling from a nail next to Henry's faded work boots. Christian had no idea the truck existed, and there were other things he would never know. "How soon can you scale up?" I asked. Robert wiped his dirty hands on an old rag and said, "About 5 weeks to prepare the soil and plant the seeds. If the weather is good, the first crop should be ready in 2 months." His eyes rested on me, sharp and cautious, the gaze of someone who has encountered many enthusiastic but unrealistic landowners. "Margaret says you should start commercial production before fall, if possible. But it won't be easy. You'll need people. You'll need to recalibrate all the machinery. You'll need to get all the permits. Are you sure you want to do it that quickly?" I remembered the call from Christian 2 days ago, his voice coming through the phone in the middle of a real estate meeting, hurried as if he were checking off a task on a list. "Are you okay, Mom? Are you rested enough?" In his mind, I was just a 62-year-old widow, content and grateful for my existence. I clenched the notebook in my hand, my gaze fixed on Robert. "I'm sure," I said firmly. Laura Bennett, a corporate lawyer, arrived at noon in a sleek black Audi, a modern look that seemed out of place on the rutted, red-dusted dirt roads of rural Ohio. She was younger than I expected, in her late 30s, with short brown hair and a firm handshake that exuded worldly confidence. "Henry always talked about you," she said as she sat down at the kitchen table, placing her leather briefcase stuffed with documents on the wooden table. He said you had the sharpest business mind he'd ever met. He might be biased, but his projections for this project were too conservative. If you did it right, you could make $1 million in 2 years. $1 million. The number hung in the air like a wisp of smoke, both alluring and distant. Henry and I had been living comfortably on his engineering salary, enough to live on, but never enough to call ourselves rich. Christian's success in real estate had made him the financial pillar of our family early on, a role he had used to exert control over my life, bit by bit. Laura spread the papers out carefully on the table. I've prepared the documents for Lawson Herbal Ventures. Henry suggested the name to represent our partnership, but also to assert her independence and legitimacy. That afternoon, I signed document after document: business licenses, patent applications, tax returns, employment contracts, until my wrists ached. Each signature was a small but steady step toward pushing back against the false narrative Christian had created about my limitations. One more thing, Laura said, carefully putting the papers back in her briefcase. Henry set up a trust before he died, $40,000, without a will or your son's consent. He wanted it to be your startup capital. I stared at her, frozen, as if time had stopped. Christian had never mentioned this. He simply didn't know. Henry has taken great care to protect you, Laura said, handing me a bank card and a stack of bank statements. He wants you to have resources that no one else in the family can touch or control. That evening, I sat on the porch with a cup of hot tea, the first leisurely drink I'd had since Henry's funeral. I called Margaret to update her on my progress. The phone signal had improved considerably after I'd ventured up onto the roof to adjust the old antenna, a skill I'd thought I'd forgotten, but that turned out to still be in me. Laura says the patent application should be approved in about 8 weeks, I informed Margaret. Robert's ready to prepare the soil for the expansion crop, which should be ready for harvest in early October, and I'll start interviewing people tomorrow. Margaret laughed over the phone. You sound different, Clara. Stronger. I smiled, feeling it. The woman who had resigned herself to Christian's control was fading, replaced by a Clara who, to my surprise, was decisive, intuitive, and full of life in the face of challenges. Henry saw this coming, I said. Margaret replied softly, he believed you would find yourself again, the woman who had built a family and a career before grief clouded everything. The next morning, 4 candidates came in for interviews, all students from the community college agriculture program that Robert had recommended. I met them at the kitchen table where I had signed the first legal papers for the company the day before. The first 2 were impressive: hardworking, honest, willing to work for the salary offered. But Emily Torres really stood out. The 23-year-old had tan, dirt-stained hands and a lively gaze that told of her childhood on her grandmother's farm in New Mexico. My family has been growing herbs and medicinal plants for 3 generations, she said. I know what it means to live with the land. This is medicinal plant production, which requires precision, not like regular gardening, I warned her. Emily just smiled. My grandmother taught me that precision is a form of respect to the soil, to the plants, and to the process. If you do it right, the results will be worth it. I hired her immediately, along with another candidate. We would start small, small enough to control, big enough to grow as the project took shape. That weekend, I drove my old pickup into town to buy more supplies and unexpectedly discovered another piece of the puzzle Henry had been quietly building. At the local hardware store, the owner, a tough guy named George Harlan, recognized me immediately. Mrs. Lawson, long time no see since Henry ordered equipment last fall, he said. What equipment? I asked, surprised. Processing machinery for your warehouse, he replied, a twinkle in his eye. It took 4 truckloads to get it all. Henry said you 2 were starting a special farming project. I packed up the supplies and drove back, my mind reeling from the new information. Henry had not only quietly mapped out the direction, but had also connected with the people around him, quietly laying the groundwork. I began to see the depth of his vision. Things became clearer on Monday morning when I got a call from Community Trust Bank. "Ms. Lawson, this is Ellen Carter, Mr. Henry's account manager," the voice said. "I'd like to ask about the progress of the business loan he applied for before he passed away." "What loan?" I asked, confused. There was a short pause. "A $45,000 loan for Lawson Herbal Ventures. It was approved a few weeks ago, but we haven't received the final application." I collapsed at Henry's old desk, stunned. "Can you send me a copy of the application?" That afternoon, a delivery man brought a thick stack of documents. Henry had applied for the loan 9 months earlier, listing me as the principal and using the land as collateral. His financial projections were detailed, careful, and convincing. The bank notes even praised the groundbreaking agricultural development opportunity and the experienced management team. Experienced management team, Henry had written about me with confidence, extolling my role in the construction company he had founded, rather than downplaying it as Christian had. In those documents, I was no longer a dazed widow with a vague idea, but a seasoned entrepreneur leading a promising project. That evening, I called Margaret to share my discovery. "Henry had the finances in place that I didn't know about," I said, still a little dazed. "We have $85,000 in startup capital. He's figured it all out." I paused, looking out over the wheat field where Emily and the workers had been working all day to prepare the land for the expansion. "Margaret, why didn't you tell me earlier? About the loan, the local connections, the scope of his plan?" Margaret said softly, her voice as soft as the wind blowing through the meadow. "3 weeks ago, you weren't ready, Clara. You still felt like you needed someone's permission to act. Henry told me to let you find your own strength, in your own way." I nodded, though she couldn't see it. If Margaret had told me everything from the start, I might have been frightened by the scope of the plan and backed out. But instead, each piece came at just the right time, at a time when I was strong enough to accept it and act on it. My phone buzzed with a text from Christian. "Long time no hear from Mom. How's everything? Sandra wants to come over soon." I looked at the message, my finger slowly swiping across the screen, and then texted back. "All right, still busy? No need to come over. Just focus on your work." Those lines were a facade, a shield. Christian thought I was lonely, lost, fading into the silent darkness. He had no idea I was running a real project, leading a team, making decisions that would shape our family's financial future. I walked out into the warehouse, where the processing equipment sat undisturbed under a heavy tarp. In 5 weeks, the place would be buzzing with activity. Within 3 months, I would be shipping my first batches of herbal extracts to distributors across the Midwest. And within a year, Lawson Herbal Ventures could be generating revenues that rivaled Christian's real estate commissions. The thought made me smile, not because I was gloating, but because for the first time in years, I felt like I was leading something meaningful. I pulled back a tarp, ran my hands over the cold steel of an extractor. Henry had chosen each piece of equipment with the care of an architect laying a foundation. He had believed in me, in my mind, in my ability to drive, even when I had stopped believing in myself. When I could only imagine surviving the pain, he had laid out a path to success. Now it was my turn to walk that path, not because Henry expected it, but because I was beginning to believe I deserved it. I wanted to be the woman he saw in me, not just a shadowy figure in the kitchen, but someone building a career amid doubt and silence. Tomorrow, Emily will start her first large-scale planting. Laura will finalize the incorporation paperwork. Margaret will officially begin the pharmaceutical licensing process for our factory. And I will continue my journey from abandoned widow to true leader, each decision weighed with both reason and intuition. Christian wanted me to be dependent, soft, and quiet. Instead, I am freer, wiser, and stronger than ever. A sweet paradox. On a Wednesday morning in early October, exactly 6 months after Christian had left me in rural Ohio, where he had assumed I would silently wither away in solitude, our first harvest began. I stood in the warehouse, now a professional processing plant, watching Emily and her team carefully clean and sort the valerian root, the project's first batch. Margaret, standing at a handheld microscope, examined the sample and nodded. The quality is beyond expectation, much better than Henry's initial tests. The extractor hummed smoothly, emitting a steady, precise sound, as if the entire system had been programmed to perform its mission precisely. Every step in the line had been practiced to perfection over the past 3 weeks. The workers worked together, every step, every movement strictly following the safety procedures and quality standards I had developed, based on Henry's meticulous notes and Laura's legal advice. By Friday, we had completed 40 vials of pharmaceutical-grade extracts, the first products, carefully sealed, ready for testing and certification. A week later, Margaret's lab partner confirmed what Henry had predicted in his meticulous notes. Our extract exceeded the industry standard by 12% in purity. "This is a game changer," Margaret said, holding up a vial of clear liquid that glowed like honey in the early morning light. "I've contacted 2 pharmaceutical companies, both of whom are ready to place orders as soon as we get FDA approval for commercial distribution." I jotted down my business notes outlining projected revenue streams and expansion plans. The numbers that came up made me pause for a moment. With a conservative projection, first-year revenue could exceed $350,000. If everything went according to plan, Lawson Herbal Ventures would hit the $1 million mark in just 2 years, just as Laura had envisioned. My phone buzzed as I was reviewing my quarterly financials. Christian's name appeared on the screen. I let it ring twice before picking up, keeping my voice calm enough to mask the energy that had been churning inside me for weeks. "Hello, Christian," I said. "Finally, Mom is on the phone," he said, his voice strained. "I've been calling all week. Sandra was worried that Mom was isolating." "Mom's fine," I said. "Just a little busy around the house." "What?" he asked, his voice tinged with suspicion. "Don't tell me you're doing some repairs yourself. That house is really run down." I looked out the kitchen window, where the warehouse had become a small but bustling hub of operations. Emily's team was checking the system for tomorrow's production. A truck from a packaging supplier had just arrived, parked at the new dock area that had been completed last month. Emily, from a distance, was giving the driver firm directions, her initiative evident. "It's nothing big," I said. "Just tending to the yard, cleaning up a few things." Good for your health," Christian said, sounding relieved. "Look, Sandra and I talked. It's almost the holidays. You should come into town with us. It's not a good winter out there alone." The holidays. I'd almost forgotten that Christmas was coming. Last year, Henry spent his last holiday in the hospital, surrounded by tubes and dire diagnoses. Christian and Sandra had only visited twice, each time rushing off to attend the inevitable parties. "You're not thinking about Christmas," I said. "That's the problem," Christian said. "You're shutting yourself out of the world. That's not good." Christian's world was one in which I existed only as someone to be regulated, supervised, a shadow with no voice, no role. "Thanks for your concern, but I'm not ready to leave the farm and go back to the city," I said. His tone changed. "That's not a suggestion, Mom. Sandra has a room ready. You can't stay there alone for Christmas. It's dangerous and unreasonable." Before I could respond, the kitchen door opened. Laura Bennett walked in, her briefcase in her arms, her face alight with great news. She motioned for me to end the call quickly. "Christian, I have to go," I said. "Someone's coming." "Who? No one's coming to visit," he retorted. "Probably a delivery," I said, and hung up before he could say anything else. I hung up before Christian could say another word, then turned to Laura Bennett, who had walked in, her face alight with a new beginning. Her eyes were bright with undisguised excitement. "The FDA just granted preliminary approval," she announced, placing a thick stack of documents on the old wooden kitchen table. "We can officially begin commercial distribution, and I've just received 2 large orders from pharmaceutical distributors." Laura spread the contracts out before me, the numbers printed on the pages making my breath catch in my throat. The initial shipment totaled over 180,000, with room for volume to increase if the market response was positive. "That's not all," she continued, her voice dripping with excitement. "A venture capital fund has reached out. They want to fund expansion. We're talking millions of dollars to take Lawson Herbal Ventures across the Midwest." I stared at the pages, my mind racing with questions and emotions. Only 6 months ago, Christian had brought me into this house as if I were an aging mother, to be kept in silence and forgotten. Now I was sitting before business opportunities that would make his real estate career fade into obscurity. "What does venture capital mean?" I asked, still confused and hopeful. Laura explained. "It means expanding into other states, building a professional management team. You'll retain control, but you'll have the resources to turn Lawson Herbal Ventures into a big business, not just regionally, but nationally." She paused, then smiled warmly and confidently. "Clara, you're on the brink of a pharmaceutical empire, yours." That evening, after Laura left with the signed contracts, which promised to bring in the first revenue within a month, I walked out into the newly expanded field. Emily and her team had done the impossible, transforming a barren patch of land once overrun by weeds into rows of lush green valerian plants that trembled in the breeze, exhaling the promise of a bountiful harvest. A new irrigation system, running through each row, delivered water and nutrients at regular intervals, clear evidence that the next harvest would be even better. The warehouse, now called the Lawson Herbal Ventures Processing Plant, glowed with white light. The night crew was in place, preparing for the next day's production, carefully following the process I'd learned over weeks of tireless testing. I suddenly remembered Christian's call, his voice, soft and full of meaning, as if I were fading from consciousness, needing to be rescued from this rural slumber. He had no idea that I was working 10 hours a day, overseeing production, negotiating contracts, managing people, and building a business that had the potential to outstrip his own real estate empire. A sense of satisfaction washed over me, so strong it was almost ecstatic, as if for the first time in my life I had the freedom to choose my own destiny. The phone buzzed with a text from Sandra. "Christian just told me about his Christmas plans. It's great that Mom is staying with us. It must be lonely there." I replied briefly, "Can't wait to see you both." Not exactly a lie. I was really looking forward to it, but not for the reason they thought. The next morning, the first shipment rolled off the farm. I stood on the side of the dirt road, watching as a truck loaded with 35 barrels of Valeriana novellum extract slowly rolled off, carrying my dream to pharmaceutical distributors in 2 neighboring states. Each barrel was more than a product. It was the product of labor, hope, and a new beginning, worth far more than the monthly income of most people I knew. When the truck pulled away, Margaret emerged with a thick file, clutching it as tightly as if she were carrying her future. "I've recalculated based on actual yields and market demand," she said, sitting down in her familiar kitchen chair where we'd planned our next move together. "If we accept the investment Laura mentioned, we could be processing 150 acres of extract in just 20 months. Conservative projections call for $10 million in annual sales by year 3. $10 million. I jotted the number down in my planner, my hands shaking slightly, trying to figure out what it meant. Christian's best year in real estate had yielded about $350,000 in commissions, and now Lawson Herbal Ventures could surpass that in less than 3 years. And that's not all, Margaret continued. A university in Ohio wants to collaborate on our farming methods. They see it as a model for medicinal herb farming. Clara will be noticed. You'll be a role model, a widow who turned a wasteland into a pharmaceutical business while everyone thought she was in misery. That afternoon, I drove into town to buy supplies, and as I passed a small cafe where Henry and I had breakfasted on our visits, I stopped. Through the glass window, I saw the old waiter, the local landscape painting still hanging on the walls, and the familiar feeling of a place that was once a gentle memory. But I was different. I was no longer the quiet woman who sat in a corner, ordering coffee in silence and sadness. Now I was the head of a business, a creator, creating value from what had been forgotten. I briefly considered calling Christian, imagining his stunned expression when he learned what I had accomplished during a time when he thought I was fading. But not yet. He needed to see my success in a setting that would force him to confront his own poor choices. Christmas would be the moment. I turned back as the sun sank below the horizon, a red sunset stretching across the fields that would soon be expanded to meet growing demand. The isolation that Christian had thought was my sentence had become the foundation of my freedom. The exile that he believed would break me had made me grow, strong and independent. In 8 weeks, I would be sitting at Christian and Sandra's Christmas table. They would ask me about country life, expecting some bleak tale of loneliness, but I would bring news that would force them to reconsider their preconceptions about my abilities and my future. That prospect, that anticipation, was almost as sweet as the success I held, almost. On Christmas Eve, I walked into the granite foyer of Christian and Sandra's elegant Chicago home, where crystal chandeliers cast soft shadows on the walls and the decorations were arranged like they belonged in an interiors magazine. Their eyes swept over me, briefly, but long enough for me to sense a quiet appraisal, as if they were trying to match the image before them to a version they had once assumed. A widowed mother, faded and melancholy. I had driven here in a new Chevy Silverado, a sturdy truck bought with the project's first profits, a symbol of independence and determination. This morning, I had gone to the hairdresser, opting for a clean, sharp style. I wore a dark blue cashmere dress that hugged my leaner figure, the result of months of outdoor work and a renewed passion. "You look different," Christian said slowly, as if trying to catch up with the image in front of him. There was a vague uncertainty in the hesitation, the discomfort of confronting something you thought you had control over. "You look great." "Thank you," I said softly, but not in a low voice, and handed Sandra a bottle of wine. It was a top-quality Merlot, more expensive than most Christmas gifts, chosen deliberately for an evening where every detail was a statement. I thought we should have something to celebrate. Sandra took the bottle, her polite smile well-timed, a smile honed over company parties and receptions that required just the right amount of grace. "It's wonderful. Come in, Mom. We have much to share." Christian and Sandra's house was exactly as I remembered it, a professional designer's house, luxurious in every detail but quietly lacking in warmth. The Christmas tree stood majestically in the living room, resplendent with silver ornaments that looked like they had stepped off the cover of an interiors magazine, spotless but soulless. Dinner, provided by a high-end Chicago restaurant because Sandra was busy with charity work, quickly became an excuse for them to grill me, each question with a hidden meaning and purpose, to reinforce the belief that I was slipping into isolation. "How is Mom doing out there?" Sandra asked, her voice as light as if she were opening an interview, as she cut into squares of steak like a geometry problem. "It must be lonely, all alone out there." "I'm rarely alone these days," I said, setting down my knife and fork calmly. Christian looked up, momentarily startled. "What do you mean?" You don't let strangers into your house, do you? I took a sip of wine. Their choice was a far cry from the Merlot I'd brought. Not strangers exactly. I work with a great team. Work? Christian paused, his eyes wide with disbelief. What kind of work, Mom? A little agricultural consulting, small scale farming, that sort of thing, I said, my voice deliberately light as if it weren't worth discussing. They exchanged glances across the table. A brief but meaningful glance, as if confirming their fears that I, in my sadness and isolation, was in some blind spot and needed rescuing, perhaps with financial intervention. Sounds interesting, Sandra said, choosing her words carefully. Like a hobby to keep you busy. It keeps me busy, I said with a small smile. Christian put down his fork, his expression turning serious. Mom, I need you to be honest. Are you doing okay financially? If you're in trouble, I can help. Dad's pension and welfare aren't enough. And if someone's trying to get you to invest in some unsound agricultural venture, I smiled, the smile of someone who knows exactly where she stands. No one's trying to get you, Christian. For the first time in months, I have control of everything. After dinner, we moved to the living room. Christian pulled a hardcover folder from a drawer, which made me smile. I knew he was preparing to step into the role of committed guardian. It contained papers related to the management of my assets, power of attorney forms, financial transfer plans, and forms that allowed him to act as my proxy to protect Mom from risk. I've thought a lot about your situation, he began, flipping the pages onto the glass coffee table, each movement deliberate, as if laying out a humanitarian strategy. I think it would make sense for me to take charge of some things: property taxes, investments, major financial decisions. Why would it make sense? I asked, leaning back on the leather sofa, my palms resting lightly on the armrests, as if both comforted and wary. Christian replied, his voice firm but tinged with pity. Because you live in a remote, disconnected area, isolated people like you are vulnerable to scammers, dishonest people who take advantage of your lack of understanding of modern finance. I raised my eyebrows gently. What kind of scammers specifically? Like contractors who overcharge for unnecessary repairs, or financial experts who put you in risky investments, he said, his eyes never leaving the file. Anyone who sees an opportunity to take advantage of someone who is hurt. Hurt, I repeated, the final syllable like a bass note on an old guitar, a word both sweet and perfumed, hanging in the room sterilized by prejudice. Christian truly believed that Henry's death had broken me inside, made me stupid, incapable of self-determination. I'm not broken, Christian, I said, my voice steady, each word cutting like a cold knife. He sighed, as if he were the one carrying the burden of adjusting to reality for me. Mom, I know you think you're fine, but the pain of loss can cloud your judgment. The fact that you're collaborating with strangers, participating in that obscure farming project, says it all. You need to be protected. Sandra nodded slightly, her voice softening as if she were playing facilitator in a family counseling session. We just want the best for you. Families are supposed to take care of each other, right? I opened my bag and pulled out a hardcover folder I'd prepared. Since we're talking about family, I said softly, setting the folder down on the coffee table next to Christian's lit laptop. There's something I want to share with you. Inside were approved regulatory permits, preliminary FDA clearances, official distribution agreements with major pharmaceutical companies, bank statements with deposits that would make Christian's commissions look like a small thing, the incorporation papers for Lawson Herbal Ventures, and a sales forecast for the coming year, estimates that would exceed $1 million. Silence filled the room like a thick layer of ice, lasting almost a minute. Christian and Sandra stared at the documents, as if they had just fallen from a world they'd never imagined I'd enter. "What is this?" Christian whispered, his voice catching in his throat. "Mom's farming project," I replied, my voice calm but as hard as granite. "It's been successful, more than I thought it would be." Christian picked up a bank statement, his fingers shaking as he turned the page. His face paled as his eyes scanned the dense numbers. "This one says Mom received $50,000 last month alone." I tilted my head, not taking my eyes off him. That month was even lower than this month. Sandra bowed low, her eyes scanning the pharmaceutical distribution contracts. Her lips parted in shock. "Clara, this is a multi-million-dollar order," she said, her voice a mixture of surprise and confusion. "Provisional orders," I corrected gently, but the original contracts were signed with very tight terms. Christian put down the bank statements, his hand shaking slightly, as if the papers had just caught fire. "How is this possible? You don't know anything about business." The remark hit an old wound I had braced myself for. Familiar prejudice, nurtured by years of insidious contempt. Even though I had spent nearly 4 decades handling the finances of Henry's construction company, from balancing the budgets, negotiating with partners, to running the entire logistics system, in Christian's eyes, I was still just a vague widow with shaking hands. "Actually, I know quite a lot about business," I replied, my voice even and decisive, as if I were repaying an old debt. "I just haven't had the chance to show it to you." He raised his hand, pointing at the pile of documents on the table with an almost desperate look. "But this is pharmaceutical distribution. This is large-scale commerce. This stuff is too complicated for me to understand." I opened my phone and scrolled through the contacts I'd accumulated over the past 6 months. An agricultural consultant, a corporate lawyer, a pharmaceutical distributor, and a prominent venture capitalist. I learned a lot about the intricacies of this business, I said, my voice as calm as if I were recounting a long, willful climb. Sandra stared at me, her eyes wide as if she were facing a completely unfamiliar version of me. "Clara, you built a pharmaceutical company in 6 months? In the middle of nowhere?" "Henry left you with a solid foundation and promising research," I replied. "You just continued what he started." Christian rose from his chair and began pacing behind the sofa, his face a mask of tension. "This is crazy. Dad never said anything about pharmaceutical research. He was a bridge engineer, Mom." "My dad is someone I've never really tried to understand," I said, my voice coming out sharper than I intended, startling both of us. I'd managed to keep my cool all evening, but Christian's blatant rejection of Henry's talents and my own had broken me. "Mom," Christian said, trying to regain control, "even if these contracts are real, you can't manage a project this big on your own. You need a mentor, a professional supervisor." "You have a professional team," I said firmly. "Margaret Thompson does the research. Laura Bennett does the legal stuff. Robert Klein coordinates the farming. Emily Torres runs the day-to-day operations. Mom has hired 10 people and plans to increase to 20 by the summer to keep up with the volume." Christian looked at me as if he were watching a tornado shatter his assumptions. The woman he had believed to be weak, fragile, and dependent was now talking calmly about expanding her staff and distributing the drug on a large scale. "That worries me," he said, his voice dripping with disbelief. "Mom, you've been tricked. They've tricked you into putting Dad's insurance money into an elaborate scheme." "Mom never touched Henry's insurance money," I said. "Where did the startup money come from?" he demanded. I smiled, not in response, but in memory of someone who was gone. "Your father was more prepared than you or I thought. He left behind resources you didn't know about, opportunities he quietly researched and arranged. He understood that you might not see what I was capable of when he was gone." The words hit Christian like an invisible slap. Henry had known his son would take me for granted, and he had quietly built a platform to keep me from falling. You mean he's hiding assets from me? He asked, his voice almost breaking. You mean he understands the difference between protecting and controlling? I said. Sandra flipped through the investment proposal Laura had prepared, her eyes wide with shock. Clara, they want to invest $12 million to expand. If this goes through, Mom will be rich. Yes, I said, my voice calm and unassuming. Christian sank back into the sofa, his face ashen as if he had just been struck. I can't understand what's going on. 6 months ago, Mom was lost. She was in grief, confused, unable to make any decisions. 6 months ago, I said, my gaze distant, you let me make decisions for you because you thought it was the way to preserve the last bond in your family. But then you realized there's a fine line between loyalty and control. I began to tidy up the file, neatly stacking the sheets in a hardcover, the same gesture I used when sorting through Henry's drawings and notes. Each movement carried a sense of finality and control. Where are you going? Sandra asked, surprised by the calmness with which I moved. To the factory, I answered curtly. We're starting our first big production run tomorrow morning, and you want to be there early. Christian jumped up as if electrocuted. You can't just leave. We're not done yet. I have to stay here to protect you from whatever those people are up to. I stopped by the hall closet and pulled out a heavy wool coat, something I had bought myself, something that cost more than Sandra's fancy dress tonight. Christian, I appreciate your concern, I said, not harshly, just calmly, like someone who knew who she was. But I don't need to be protected from my own success. Success? He countered, his voice strained like a wire just reaching its limit. That's a delusion. People like you don't start a pharmaceutical company. The words hung in the air as a perfect encapsulation of all the skepticism and contempt he had quietly poured out on me over the past few months. To him, I was still just a single, fragile widow who couldn't build anything meaningful. You're right, I said, shrugging the coat over my shoulders. People like Mom rarely start pharmaceutical companies. They're convinced they're too weak to start. I walked out the door and turned to look at them one last time. Christian and Sandra stood side by side in the doorway of the living room, their faces blank, as if the whole hierarchy in their heads had collapsed. I probably won't be there next year, I said, my voice steady. Lawson Herbal Ventures is expanding into 2 more states, and Mom will be traveling to oversee the new facilities, but I really appreciate the dinner. The Chicago night was chilly, the wind blowing across my cheeks, and I felt more alert than ever as I walked to my parked truck. Behind me, Christian and Sandra's voices drifted through the half-open door, hurried, frantic, as if they were trying to piece together a story in which they were no longer the main characters. I drove away from the quiet neighborhood toward the highway that led back to Ohio, to the farm, the team, the dream I had made a reality. The clock on the dashboard read 9:52 p.m. In 8 hours, the morning shift would begin, producing the largest batch of extract the company had ever handled. Christian had wanted me to be dependent, meekly grateful for his control. But instead of being weak, I had become something he could not have foreseen: independent, determined, and strong. Henry's voice echoed in my head. They want to push you aside, Clara. Show them you can turn barren land into fertile fields. I smiled, my foot pressing hard on the gas, eager to return to the life I had built from exile, the career I had built from the discarded, the future I had reclaimed from the ashes of false expectations. The woman they had despised was now triumphant, whole and undeniable.